Oh boy, here goes nothing. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today it's a sustained screech surrounded by asterisks, and it's the odds and ends video. Alright, it is time once again for my least favorite segment of this channel, in which I go down most of the side projects of an artist that the main album reviews couldn't cover and max out my tolerance for said artist. But in the case of these guys in particular, this video was especially important to get through, because as highly regarded as Autechre's studio albums are, covering only those skips pretty big chunks of their discography that many would consider just as important, if not even more so. These guys have put out a ton of EPs in between many of their album releases, a few of which are even album length or even longer. And I feel like a series on these guys wouldn't be fully complete if I didn't speak on these projects as well, even if I wasn't exactly, looking forward to doing so. Now I'll have to make some caveats before I begin. I should first note that I don't have even close to as much of a personal connection with the EPs and side projects as I do with the main albums. I technically had listened to pretty much all of these before at one point in like a couple of mini marathons like 2-3 years ago, but none of them exactly cracked into regular listening rotation. And some of the one-off singles I only heard just for the first time for this video, so yeah, no real nostalgia factor to speak of with any of these, as it might for you. Just, something worth keeping in mind. It's also worth noting that this video does not cover every single EP or side project that they've ever put out. For instance, I skipped over the Bass Cadet remixes and that collab with the Hafler trio, their work in the band Guesscom, their random split EPs with other artists, and of course, I will also not be covering AE Live, on the merits of that release being 28 hours of music, and not even including the 7 additional hours they released like just last week or something, and which brings up the total to like 35-36 hours. If you've got the patience to sit through all that, more power to you, but I mean, give me a freaking break here. And there may be other minor releases that I just forgot even existed because they were too hidden in the recesses of their catalog, but this does cover pretty much all the EP releases, and a couple of one-off singles here and there. 17 different releases, which I will be going into. May as well get into it. So, we're starting at the very beginning of Sean Booth and Rob Brown's career, not with Autechre, but under the name Lego Feet. In 1991, they released an LP under this name, which was not only the first thing they ever released, but was also the first release ever on the pretty well-known IDM label Scam Records. Technically self-titled, but reissued in 2011 with extra tracks and retitled under its catalog number Ska 001 CD. I think Lego Feet is just a more concise name, but whatever. And that 20th anniversary reissue is, of course, the version that I heard. Pretty loaded piece of history, huh? To think how different the electronic music world as we know it would be without this project, and this label, and everything it led to. Just a shame it's rather boring to listen to by today's standards. And maybe that's a little harsh, I don't know, but this project personally did not really make me feel strongly one way or the other. It's 4 tracks ranging from 15 to 20 minutes each, taking up 73 total minutes, and pretty clearly all made up of several different shorter tracks strung together ad nauseum, and the music itself is fine, I guess, if clearly coming from a pair of guys who didn't have nearly the same technical skill they would have only 2 years later. It's a very basic and flatly produced techno album that, sure, you could make the case was ahead of its time for 1991, but it's basically just a historical curiosity at this point. It's got a few moments here and there. Part 1 did start out with some grooves that I would more call subtle instead of just dull, and it transitions into some pretty banging parts after that. Though once that section's gone by, it kind of loses my interest after that. Part 4 had a couple of neat, more melodic sections too in the beginning, and I also like that whole section with the drum breaks and twittering birds at the very end. But for the most part, this project is a sea of gray and dull grooves with lifeless acid synths and bleeping leads, percussion textures nearly identical to those you'd eventually hear on Incunabula, but not as good sounding. Some very lo-fi samples that could either be hip-hop drum breaks or voices, but always had like really bad recording fidelity and low bit depth. and the whole project just seems to go on and on for ages. I obviously haven't heard the original album to confirm which tracks were actually on the LP for myself or how much better it is as a listening experience, but obviously this project was doubled in length by its inclusion of lots of bonus tracks created from the same era but never released, and boy does it show that half of this project is bonus tracks. I mean, part 3, the longest side at over 20 minutes, is also the least interesting. There's like a cool old school hip hop thing at the very beginning, but once that's done, the remainder of the project just seems to drag on forever, and by the end of it, I'm just totally done and want to leave this project in the recycle bin. I mean, okay, Lego Feet isn't annoying to listen to, and I'm sure it was great for the time, but by my perspective, it hasn't aged that well. It's all stuff I've heard plenty of times before, and unless you were one of the lucky few who actually got to pick this up when it first came out, before the electronic music scene really started to change to these kinds of sounds and you hadn't yet experienced anything like it, I can't imagine it'll offer anything particularly mind-blowing for most people either, aside from the experience of knowing you've heard the first ever release that these guys ever made. Or if you ever really wanted Aphex Twin to make an album in the style of his Bradley Strider singles, it'd probably turn out something like this. Of course, if you find its dated palette of sounds and super low-budget production to still be charming in its own way, or hit some old nostalgia buttons, or you're just one of those people that's like, analog synth automatically makes music better, I can't totally argue with that. I mean, I get that perspective, but as someone who didn't get into this until I'd obviously already had a wealth of knowledge of techno that came in years following, and had heard not only all the other Autechre studio albums, but lots of other similar sounding old techno and IDM projects, I just found it to be not much more than a dated and dull slug that's dragged out far too long for its own good by this reissue. I can recognize its place in history, but I've got no desire to listen to it again once this video goes up. It's probably like a 5.7 out of 10 for me. There we go, that will probably be the most controversial take of this video out of the way right off the bat, so let's get into the good stuff. Alright, next up, a single that came out later the same year, 1991, and the first thing to be released under the Autechre name, the single Cavity Job, released on Hardcore Records. It is just a single, just this track and its B-side, Accelera 1 and 2, and that's it. As such, I will not be giving it a rating. But I will say right off the bat that I think it's one of my favorite little curiosities in their catalog. If one that sounds absolutely nothing like literally anything else these guys ever released in their lifetime. It's much more hard-hitting, hip-hop influenced stuff, with all these crashing break beats and dark but grooving acid bass lines and really obvious uncut samples from like TV shows and stuff. Even DJ scratching in some points. There's a little bit of the Autechre we know and love with some of the drum machine patterns and synth settings that you could see carrying over into Incunabula, but yeah, when I first heard this, it was like legit shocking. It's just so unrepresentative of their usual work. But it was shocking in the best way. Like, they made these pure hardcore bangers that are actually pretty catchy and hit ridiculously hard. Even without the context of who made them, I'd be into them. It's always going to stick out in my mind like a sore thumb in their catalog. In a good way, obviously. I've seen it compared to the material on Orbital's Green album, and yeah, I can see that too. Not that far a cry from something like Ooh-La. Especially that one part like 3 minutes into Accelera 1 and 2, it sounds like the end of that track. The guy I saw making that comparison didn't actually like the single much, but I mean, you can't get me to compare something to Orbital in a negative way. Still very much a curiosity in their catalog, and one that almost feels like it directly goes against the appeal of all their subsequent output, but one that I can get much more enthusiastic for than I can for Lego Feet. I can appreciate a pair of Autechre tracks that fairly explicitly do not call for brain usage. Definitely worth checking out. But now it's time to get into the bulk of the Autechre EPs. Starting out with their 1994 EP, Anti, released in between Incunabula and Amber, and the only time that Autechre ever attached a direct political statement to their music. And it was the same statement that Orbital made when they put 4 Minutes of Silence on their Are We Here single that same year. Yes, this EP is a protest against the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, the law that gave the police the power to break up rave parties playing music described as a series of repetitive beats. And Autechre donated the profits for the EP to a political pressure organization called Liberty. Now, back when I reviewed Orbital Snivelization, I may have incorrectly assumed the criminal justice bill meant that they were closing dance clubs. Kind of like that one time a few years ago, the Fabric Club was almost closed because drum and bass was a hazard to public safety or something stupid like that. I think this bill was more about, you know, outdoor parties. But the anti-EP actually goes about protesting the bill in a more creative way than Orbital did, which is not something I would have liked to admit, but rather than make Orbital's type of sweeping blunt statement that the bill would lead to silence, they instead poked at the bill's vague wording, with 2 tracks that had repetitive beats, Lost and Dejarum, which they recommended not playing should the bill become law, unless they wish to be seen as demonstrating direct opposition to said law, and a 3rd track, Flutter, in which every bar had a different sequence of percussion so as to directly avoid having repetitive beats, and they jokingly recommended people playing the track should have a musicologist and a lawyer on hand to explain this in case of police harassment. That is actually a genius idea, not gonna lie, and one that actually aimed to educate people on the law. Orbital did not pull that off. Obviously, this wouldn't really be a relevant protest now, given the electronic music scene didn't really go anywhere, even after the bill became law. Oh, to live in a world when that was the biggest problem we had to deal with. But the actual music mostly still holds up. First 2 tracks still kind of adhere to regular 90s techno and IDM formulas, feeling like a product of their time and their label, though with a bit of that mechanical edge later explored on Try-Repeat-A. I wouldn't say any of these tracks are the best they've ever done, but they do get better as they go on. Lost is kinda plain but has some nice melodies. Dejarum is a bit more characteristic of their style and has these squeaking textures that remind me of something I feel like I heard on a Charlie Brown soundtrack album once. And Flutter obviously had the most creative concept, also happens to sound the best of the 3 as well. The skittering percussion still comes together to form a regular pulse, but has this really smooth feeling to it, aided by the airy melodies on top that very slowly build and progress as you go along. Their efforts to not be repetitive has a pretty direct lineage to their later more experimental work, but still presents it in an easily digestible manner. And I really like how the track just bleeds into ambience in the last 2 minutes as well. The EP as a whole, while not the most impressive thing they ever did, or the kind of thing I see myself coming back to regularly after this, certainly is worth a shot for people still clamoring for more stuff like their first 3 albums, and fans of the more experimental stuff can at least give its closer a shot to see a precursor to where they'd slide off afterwards. It's pretty good stuff. I'll give it a solid 7 out of 10. So yeah, that was a nice EP, but I gotta say, their next EP, it was just garbage. Low-hanging fruit I couldn't resist. So yeah, from what I've heard, this is a collection of material that didn't make the cut for Amber, hence the album cover, which looks like glitched up shreds of Amber's cover, and also hence the title, though you're going to get people very angry if you imply the title is fitting on any deeper level than that. It was also included on the bonus 2nd disc on the Try-Repeat-A++ CD I have here, alongside the Anvil Vapre EP. It's right here. We'll get to that in a bit. But yes, I agree with the generally held statements that Garbage is one of their better EPs. Maybe even their single best EP, if nothing else than for its opening and closing tracks. The slow-building opener, Garbage Mix 36, may start out as some squonky and simplistic minimal techno track and takes a while to really get going, but as it goes on, more and more elements are introduced and it pays off into some beautiful washes of synth strings. Well, making use of its 14 minutes of length really takes you on a journey. And the EP's closer, V-Letter Mix 21, is a beautiful and moody minimal ambient piece, not unlike what they later did with Altabiz from Quaristice, but here fleshed out to a much more substantial 8.5 minutes. I presume having this EP playing second on Try-Repeat-A's bonus disc is specifically to make sure that that track is the ending, because it works so well in that way. The other 2 tracks here don't stick out to me nearly as much or give me much to say, but they are some pretty cool, like, little minimalistic ambient techno excursions. I suppose Bronchus 7 Mix 24 is supposed to be a companion to Bronchus 2 from Incunabula, though it's not much more memorable than that track was. Also, the numbers at the end of each track on this EP apparently correspond to what percentage of the EP's total running time their respective tracks take up. Like, PIOB Mix 19 is 19% of the running time, so yeah, that's a thing. Just in case you were curious. But yeah, overall, the EP is pretty good. Worth giving a shot if you want more material in the amber vein. It's some nice chill stuff here. I can even see myself hanging on to this one beyond this video. I like it. I think I can give it a 7.5 out of 10. And then from the same year, I believe, there's Anvil Vapre, which is much more obviously made of runoffs from Try-Repeat-A. As you can also tell from the packaging, which matches that of the main album, provided you actually open it beyond its boring-ass front cover. Admittedly, this EP doesn't really have any particular personal favorites, but there is some cool stuff to be found here. I do think Closer Second Ping got a bit too long-winded, even if it has a pretty catchy honking bass line. And second track, Second Skeep, while including some pretty fun vocal glitches and plunking bass lines a la Slip from Amber, kinda disappears from my mind as soon as it's done. Some versions of this EP have the titles of the second and third tracks swapped just to make things more of a headache. Including, that was the case on my iPod somehow. I'm not sure how it got like that, or why that is a thing. But I'm just going by what the Wikipedia and Discogs pages say. But whatever, I do quite like the other two tracks here. The banging breakbeats and bursts of fuzzy static on Second Vaudeville Bell hits really hard, and there's even a random tempo change halfway through for the hell of it. That track would have fit right at home in the main track listing of Try-Repeat-A. And third track, Second Scout, was a pretty big highlight as well, with these pretty playful and almost cheerful melodies that kind of remind me of those on Autechre, but obviously with a much heavier beat. That one's pretty fun. I mean, as a whole, I don't consider the Anvil Vapre EP to be a huge standout in their catalog. They do still feel like B-sides, and I wouldn't replace any of them with the original album tracks. Second Vaudeville Bell is probably better than, say, Rotar on the main album, which, yeah, that's pretty dang good. But it's also not on the level of Stud or Lateral or Ursidio or my other big favorites from the main album. So, take that all as you will. I think it's worth a shot, but I'd say go to Try-Repeat-A first, and if you really love that, then you can come here. Probably not essential listening otherwise, but it's got its moments. 6.7 out of 10 for me, I guess. Another little companion to Try-Repeat-A that fans might enjoy if they're clamoring for more of that kind of stuff is the mail-order-only single We Are RY, RY Are We. That's a title that sticks with you. I only just heard these two tracks for the first time while preparing for this video, and they're alright. Pretty simplistic techno stuff, banging drum machine, sparse melodies, complete with surface noise. I will say, though, that I did also check out the 33 and the third RPM versions of these tracks that were also uploaded to YouTube, and I think those are much more worth your time than the regular 45 RPM versions. Slowing down the tempo created a more menacing and stomping quality to these tracks that made them more memorable cuts in my eyes. Otherwise, they're basically the kind of thing that these guys could do in their sleep. Nothing essential, but it's a nice little curiosity for anyone interested. No rating for this. So next up we got an EP that was released as a lead-up to Cichlisuite in 1997 called Envane. And it's pretty neat stuff. Now it does have one track that admittedly rises above all the others, the opener, Gauze Quarter. It has kind of a bouncier, plunky feel to it and features all these DJ scratching sounds all over it that make the whole mix pretty heavily resemble Boards of Canada's 6010. Hearing the repetitive Dr. Octagon sample saying, "Jam like a psycho," gives the whole track a little bit more of a playful bend. Well, actually, I think the line is "Jam like Autechre," so no wonder it showed up here, but I can only ever hear "Jam like a psycho." Same difference, really. And halfway through this track, they introduce these other windy, whistling melodies that are really freaking nice, even seem to give this track some emotional depth. If nothing else, the EP is worth checking out for that track. The other three tracks all tend to blend together for me, but they do have some crisp banging beats a la Sidepater going up against these chilly but oddly comforting synth pads. The last 2-3 minutes of Latent Quarter even sounds like you get these woodwinds joining in the mix for the little extra bit of warmth and texture. Laughing Quarter has the most propulsive and dramatic mix on the EP, and Drawn Quarter, aside from the eye-roll-worthy pun in its title, does also sort of live up to its title, as it's a bit drawn out, at over 10 minutes. Maybe a little repetitive, though not the worst case of that I've ever seen. I don't really have much to say about the EP besides that, but I will say it's at least got a feel to it that separates it from the rest of their catalog. Even if the specific textures of Quaristice.Quadrange are more memorable to me, I do think this EP has a warmer and more welcoming feel to it than the album it accompanies. Not one I've really put on or really stuck with me, but there is some definite merit to be found here to make it worth giving a shot, and one that actually does carry more of a human element to it and more emotion than a lot of their other projects. It's a grower. I think this can get away with a 7.3 out of 10. Next, there was one other EP as a companion to Quaristice.Quadrange from that same year called Cichlisuite, or Cichlisuite, depending on who you ask. Now, there is of course a track called Cichlisuite on the main Quaristice.Quadrange album, and you'd think this would mean it would center around repurposing that track sounds, but no, it's just 5 originals that have nothing to do with that track at all. With the exception of the final track, Tilapia, the lead melodies on that one do in fact have the same texture as the leads on the original track, but even there, those leads don't show up until halfway through. The rest of the EP is actually more like a prelude to the ideas they'd go on to explore on LP5. The mixes do have a strangely intimate feeling to them, very low-key and small in scale, and the rhythms are slowly getting more chaotic and unconventional as well. Unfortunately, there's no big showstopper track here, like an Acro Year 2 or a Drain 2 or a Fold 4 Rap 5. If these tracks were on LP5, they'd all be among the lower points on there, but thankfully we don't have to worry about that being a thing. Opener Yee's Land isn't the most impactful way you could ever start, but it still develops some solid groove with its tapping and shifting beats and squelching acid bass, and these warmer but thin synth pads come in and progress and give me some vague Metamatics vibes. Don't think he was around yet at this point, but whatever. Pensha, meanwhile, has a jerky beat and plinky, seemingly random-sounding blooping melodies, but eventually builds into all these heavily detailed and more enveloping mixes later on. Cherokee, meanwhile, doesn't have the most coherent of pulses, but I can't be bothered to count out the time signature on this one. It almost feels like it's constantly speeding up and slowing down, but there's something kind of weirdly catchy about the plinking melodic textures weaving in between the mix. Crib has a 30-second intro of squeaky textures that didn't really feel necessary, but once it gets started, we break into these really moody pads, glassy wubbing melodies, and a thumping beat with all these textures that sound like dropping individual marbles into an empty glass jar, or something like that. It's the shortest track in the bunch, but it's definitely the most immediate one as well. And finally, Tilapia. That one may cycle through some minimal but fast-paced beats and humming pads for a while, but as I mentioned before, about 2.5 minutes in, the lead synths from the actual Cichlisuite return, playing a different melody, but still clearly the same setting. And once that happens, the track kicks into high gear with lots of other pads joining in and intensifying the mix. And it turns out to be a really satisfying finish. Overall, I mean, this EP isn't one of my big favorites, really. It falls into the background really easily and doesn't have a lot of textures that really stick out to me. It's all very low-key and low stakes and small and self-contained, and nothing really grabs my attention unless I'm, like, physically trying. And even then, many tracks here don't really deliver their best ideas until they've already gone on for a while. I don't know, it certainly is a unique point in their catalog, though. One that does still have its own feel separate from any of their albums. Not to mention their attention to detail and the density of their mixes is really coming into focus in a big way, not shown on previous releases. Just that, you know, then LP5 came in a year later and blew this out of the water with way stronger and more satisfying cuts. I don't know, I think I'm kind of going against the grain with my opinion on this one, probably not hanging on to it after this video, but other people really got into it, and I feel like I can still get why. It's fine, I think I can give it like a 6.7 out of 10. So next up we're moving on to 1999, kinda sorta, with the Peel session. Technically made up of material I obviously did for a session on John Peel's Radio 1 show, originally aired in 1995. As you may guess, it's not the biggest point of interest in these guys' catalog or something they probably put a lot of thought into, but it is mostly notable for having the track Drain on it. If that name sounds familiar, it's because it's the start of that IDM tennis they did with Aphex Twin that resulted in LP5's closing track Drain 2. As I already said in the LP5 review, I think Drain 2 was probably the best thing to come out of that whole back and forth. But Drain is a pretty solid track too, having this deceptively minimal clicking beat building up with all these dramatic swirling organ pads later on, and chopping up those organ pads so that they have that kind of bouncing speed-up effect. The other two tracks, Milk DX and Inhake 2, they are pretty good as well, providing some whooshing and mechanical foot-tapping beat work that's pretty satisfying. The latter has some quirky vocal-like sounds and fun little playful melodies too. Probably not gonna remember they exist, but they're fun while they're on. I mean, overall the EP's good. It's a point of interest, worth a listen if you're curious. It's about as good as the Anti-EP. Maybe even a tiny bit better, albeit without the cool, clever political backstory and context behind it. I enjoyed it. Probably just gonna take it off my iPod once this video's done, but I didn't have much expectations for it, having forgotten anything that happened in it, and coming back I was pleasantly surprised, so I think I can give this a solid 7 out of 10, I think. But the same year that the PL session was released, they put out an EP of new music as well, and not just any old EP. An EP which totaled 70 minutes, and had enough substance to be a mainline album. I'm of course talking about EP7. This comes in between LP5 and Confield, and you may surmise from that we're gonna get some pretty freaky and heavily detailed stuff, and you'd basically be correct. Perhaps unfortunately, it's not as good as the two albums it bridges the gap between. No just giant showstopper tracks, no real wow factor. The technical achievements on display here aren't any more impressive than stuff they'd already done at this point. There are even a few moments here which almost feel like they're running on autopilot and feel kind of run-of-the-mill by their standards. Though I would not say that this is an outright skippable release either. There's still quite a few good moments to speak of that make it still worth giving a shot. I think EP7 starts good and ends even better, but it kind of has an okay middle. I mean, the way it starts is interesting. If you had the original CD, you can rewind from the first track and end up in a hidden track full of glassy, screeching, super unnerving organ synth pads, as if you've just walked into the wrong dimension. It's a nice little Easter egg there. And opener Arpeg does have some watery, if still pretty foot-tapping grooves to it. The percussion is super splashy, like you're slapping the surface of the water in a pool or a filled-up sink. And the melodies on top, while not exactly the focus, have like a kind of a strange woodwind-y quality. It's pretty cool stuff. The following track, CCEC, it has all these unintelligible, chopped-up vocal snippets all over the place, accompanying a pretty solid beat that thumps along some creeping and thin melodic lines. And Squeller has all these heavy but strangely hollow beats clanking together and performing a pretty satisfying and bouncy groove. And that bleeping glitchy outro is a nice touch too. Fun stuff all around. After this, the EP7 kind of trails off into just okay territory. Left Blank starts out pretty cool with its fast-paced low-key percussion textures over an air conditioning pad, and even goes through a few different phases afterwards, but really only that first part left any impression on me. Once that air conditioning pad goes away at the halfway mark, it feels like the track loses its sense of stakes and just kind of meanders aimlessly. It's not bad, but it's not great either. Output is a track that I want to like more than I do. It starts out with some kind of TV tuning sound and builds into this dramatic and propulsive pad that has this electrifying quality to it, while the beat underneath marches along in 6/8 time. Pulls me in pretty quickly, but trouble is this track doesn't really have any new ideas to offer over its 7-minute running time. It gets kind of repetitive and wears out its welcome a little. I'd really like this track if it stopped after 4 minutes, but as is, it's fine. On the second half of the EP, you got Drop, which has some melancholy synth melodies that sound cool at first, but then this big whooshing beat crashes all over it and drowns it out, and it doesn't really feel like the melodies and beats really mesh well together. And Lick Flea, unfortunately, did not predict Adam Neely's Lick meme. It just kind of shows one of their usual tapping percussion romps that eventually gets all bit crushed a la the end of Daft Punk's Short Circuit. Nothing sticking out as particularly special about it. There's a moment where the bass intensifies and it sounds like the track's really about to kick into high gear, but unfortunately that doesn't happen until like the last 30 seconds of the track. It ends up feeling more like a tease. Thankfully, after this, though, the EP picks back up for me in a big way with Maphive 6.1. This track starts out with all these MIDI timpanis and wheeshing pads, sounds totally different from most other tracks I've heard from them, and then switching into a whole section of jazzy upright bass and old-timey piano, and it later builds into a groove made up of lots of vibraphone melodies. Certainly has more than enough interesting ideas to justify its 8-minute running time, and even if all this extra instrumentation sounds like, you know, your standard Windows 98 style MIDI wavetables, it's such a breath of fresh air to hear on a project like this. I will most definitely take it. It feels like a more lighthearted and unserious precursor to Seafern or something. There's one more point with Zeiss Contorex. That one takes a while to get going. Has a pretty long intro of random fuzzy noises that never really goes anywhere, but eventually cuts into this weird shepherd's tone groove that kind of buzzes all over the place. It's alright, has a nice build-up eventually. I wish it didn't end in a straight hard cut. Netlon Sentinel, meanwhile, feels like the true payoff to its preceding track, hitting a lot harder with lots of fuzzy and glitched drums that do have quite a bit of weight to them. Kind of reminds me of 6IE.CR from Draft. And there's some kind of warm pads that come in later for extra texture and even get a whole sidetrack to themselves. But then finally we close with Purr, A mix of metallic clanking and water splashing as if you're trying to pull something out of a sink drain, and some nice, heartfelt, comforting, contemplative synth melodies plinking away on top. Satisfying way to go out, and one that even kind of mirrors the opener in a neat way. So that's EP7. In one breath, I don't think it's anything mind-blowing. A lot of moments just feel like Autechre are doing exactly what you would expect them to do. And the EP isn't very cohesive either, it just feels like a collection of random ideas that they had lying around rather than coalescing into a unified experience. Probably why it's not classified as a main album. And none of these tracks are among my favorites from them either. Even Maphive 6.1. That is a really good track, especially in context, but it's not on Seafern's level or anything. Still, there are enough interesting ideas and experiments here to still be worth giving a shot. There's certainly nothing offensive here or any tracks that are like an outright turnoff. I don't love it, but you may end up finding something that really resonates with you here. It's pretty nice. I can probably give EP7 a fitting score of a solid 7 out of 10. If I can't give Graf 7.30 a 7.3, I can do that instead. So, moving on. Next up, one last EP, technically from the end of 1999, but released in early 2000. That's Peel Session 2. This one I guess is interesting because Autechre didn't actually name these tracks themselves, believe it or not. John Peel did. I'm not sure whether he just came up with the names himself or got them from listener suggestions. Got conflicting anecdotes on that one. Though I do believe Autechre came up with the last title based on something Peel said about them. But whatever, besides that little tidbit, the EP itself really isn't anything you absolutely need to bother yourself with. Opener Gelk is the best track, has some cool melodies in the beginning, even if they're later abandoned in favor of some weird meandering stuff that isn't nearly as engaging. Bleefill is like if you mixed Pen Expers and Under BOAC and got something totally forgettable. Gayquad is pretty decent, like Yeasland from Cichlisuite if it had less groove, but had other sparkling melodies on top, even had a bit of mini pizzicato strings at one point that I liked. Not bad, but nothing I'm gonna remember. And 19 Headaches, I mean, boy is that title some low-hanging fruit, and it is not unfitting. Really more than anything, it's just a boring set of low-key glitchy noises that just aimlessly meanders and never goes anywhere interesting. I mean, overall, I don't care about this EP. I don't think most people do either, save for diehard completionists. You won't find anything offensive here, but neither will you find any huge overlooked gems. It's entirely skippable. First Peel Session was much better, and this is like a 5.5 out of 10. But speaking of 19 Headaches, we next move along into 2002 with their EP Gantz Graf. A bridge between Confield and Graf 7.30. Definitely my two favorite releases in their catalog. The title track from this EP has kind of earned a reputation as being one of the most extreme and intense things these guys ever put out, if not the most. Which should really be saying something, especially given the album it came off the coattails of. Perhaps not shockingly, given my general opinions on Confield and Draft, I don't personally care for this EP all that much. It's all a bit much for my tastes. But if this is like your favorite release of theirs, I feel like I'd get it here more than basically any of the other projects covered in this video. It is Autechre at their loudest and most abrasive maybe ever. I would recommend watching the music video for Gantz Graf. It syncs up like every minute glitch into fast-moving 3D renders to like a painstaking level of detail. Makes the track feel all the more impressive and mind-bending to listen to. As for the other two tracks on the EP, they're not exactly any easier to listen, though they all flow together as if they were parts of the same track. Dial is actually probably the most headache-inducing moment here, with its weird dissonant organ melodies constantly descending and feeling particularly undulating and off-putting. And later you heard some weird half-dead screaming sounds barely poking out of the mix. I would not recommend listening to this one on the toilet. It did not help. And Cap.4, some people have compared that one to Lentic Catachresis in the way it starts out with a pulse and ends up submerged in pure entropy. It doesn't go all out rhythmless till right near the end though, and even has some slightly more coherent and warmer melodies on top for much of it. Probably the most welcoming track of the three. If that means anything. Still pretty intense stuff, obviously. I mean, overall, I don't personally enjoy listening to this EP, but it is definitely a standout in their catalog for better or for worse. Not one you will easily forget. I'd still recommend giving it a shot. While the EP is not really my thing, it's probably like a 6.5 out of 10 for me. It is pretty heavily acclaimed, and I still think it is worth it for the experience. Alright, next. Bit more of a jump ahead in time here to 2008, with a companion to their Quaristice album. They released a limited CD of that album that had an entire extra bonus disc called Quaristice Versions. This disc is not available on streaming services. Technically, the only way to hear it legally is to go out and find a used copy of that limited edition CD, of which only 1,000 copies exist, and are going up on Discogs for some pretty big chunks of change. I definitely didn't just go out and find an unofficial upload someone posted on YouTube to hear it myself. From what I can tell, it's made out of re-edited extended versions of tracks on the main album, and I've seen people who thought these more fleshed out versions made for an altogether better experience. Including one guy in the Discogs comments who was incredibly salty that it became so hard to find and the main album apparently paled so much in comparison. Now, of course, I don't think there was anything wrong with the original album's pacing. The kind of scattered feel and structuring of all the smaller tracks was part of the appeal for me. As such, I don't really see these as anything more than like a cool curiosity and just a different way of listening to the same material I'd already heard before. Now, some of these versions were, in fact, worth the trouble. The PLC's new edits, the PLC LCPC, right off the bat throws in a whole new section in the middle and another section at the end that introduces these pretty menacing and catchy bass lines. I will give you that is in fact a pretty big improvement on the original. Sondirama also went from being a fairly nondescript interlude to becoming an actual track in the form of Sondiri IX. Has some pretty cool, creepy ascending synth lines and other weird bleepy textures. It's cool. 901016101 may not have much in common with its respective original from what I heard, but it is a pretty fun thumping techno number. And while I was not looking forward to hearing the 11.5-minute full 4, given full 3 was my least favorite on the main album, it turns out they bring in some actual rhythm and structure to the track. It has a proper beat now, it feels like it's actually going somewhere. Still don't love it exactly, but I cannot deny that this version smokes the original. And of course, Autechre is expectedly welcome, reprising no melodic motifs from Altabiz, but accomplishing the same mood quite effectively. On the other hand, some of these edits just feel kind of pointless. Like, Plyphon got repurposed into Philopin, and barely changed at all, save for, I guess, the beat coming back in at the very end or something. I didn't really notice that much different. And they had a little barely present melodic section to Tankakern to make Tan Kraken and call it a day. That was disappointing. And No 4 is cool at first, but nearly half its running time is just a fade out. Purlent's I.O. and Shank 9 also weren't super fundamentally improved by their extensions into Purlent's Range 3, I.O. Mons, and Shank 9X, respectively. The latter they just haphazardly stuck on a new section that just sounds like Purlent's and doesn't really build into the original groove much. I mean, overall, Quaristice Versions is what it says it is. It's a bunch of alternate takes. I do not think it is an effective replacement for the main album like some people have made it out to be. A few of these takes do in fact improve upon their original mixes, but with maybe the exception of the PLC's new edits, which probably would have still matched the original pacing, I don't think any of these would have translated better on vanilla Quaristice. I'm probably just gonna stick to that. Won't give the versions a rating, but if it sounds interesting to you, feel free to seek it out. But perhaps a more interesting addition to the Quaristice lore is Quaristice.Quadrange.ep.ae, technically classified as an EP with more of what appears to be new versions of some tracks from Quaristice, mostly Purlent's and 90101-5LL. 9 of the 13 cuts on Quadrange are just alternate versions of those two tracks in particular. But also, this EP is really 4 different EPs totaling up to almost 2.5 hours of music. And seems to be a result of their playing with digital-only formats. The first time where they realized, hey, now with the internet and the advent of MP3s and everything, we don't have to edit our tracks down to fit within a 70-80 minute time span anymore. We can just release these giant-ass tracks as is. But given it's supplementary to an album, let's just call it an EP. I do think the Quadrange EP does a better job of justifying its existence than Quaristice Versions does, though. Most of these tracks don't directly follow their respective originals and feel more like their own thing. The PLC CCC, for instance, that has that bass line in common with the alternate take from Quaristice Versions, not the original album cut. But it just kind of runs with that by itself in this fairly low-key, minimal, repetitive jam. Well, there are some cuts here that just follow the original. Purulence Range 7, for instance. But that is a much more expansive, meditative, and satisfying rework than Range 3 was. Even though it basically has every element from the original, stretching it out to 10 minutes makes it much more obvious how they're adding to the experience. Purulent Suns seems to imply a mashup of Purulence and Parallel Suns, but doesn't really resemble either of them. Just a few synth plunks covered in reverb for that usual chilly vibe. And 90101.50.16 mostly seems to be an extended version of the versions cut of the track, building into some new fiddly melodies at the end. I'm game for that, especially since the versions cut just kinda faded out uneventfully anyway. This feels like the real version, like what that version was really supposed to be building to. On the second volume of the EP, you got 90132, which has nothing to do with its core track. Some super minimal, spooky whistling melodies, cooing and humming away for 2 minutes. Taka Kenren, meanwhile, isn't the most substantial of additions to its original cut, aside from now being much more long-winded. Don't totally mind 10 minutes of Tangakern, though. By the end, it sounds like the mix is trying to move up an elevator or something. 90101.50.119 picks up right where the last version left off and continues that groove for another 12.5 minutes, because why the hell not, I guess. But Purulent Subrange 3 is more interesting, kind of carrying over some of the percussion of the previous track and moving it into darker and slower territory, really serving up some cool atmosphere. These Purulence mixes slowly getting more and more removed from their original cuts is pretty cool. On the third and shortest volume of the EP, Chenk 91 Dub messes around with the original track's final moments for a little bit. 901017121 actually more resembles the original version of the track than any of the other cuts here, with an intensified and deeper mix layered with dark ambient melodic washes. And these mixes continue to deepen as we move into the even more muted and low-key and atmospheric depths of Purulence Lucid 2, which barely sounds like Purulence at all anymore, besides maybe those hyper-reverb synths coming from the same setting as those melodies at the beginning. And No 2-2, it's the original No 2, but with 4 extra minutes of airier textures. Not much to say about that one. Now, this EP has all been well and good. The first 3 volumes have been pretty good, low-key, ambient, and ambient techno cuts, if occasionally some ideas being pretty redundant and just extending out versions of other tracks. You can kind of see how this material eventually led them to the direction they went on Elsic and NTS. But the real reason this EP is remembered is for the closer. A 58-minute cut, which gets a volume of the EP all to itself, the deeply meditative and minimal ambient experience that is Purulence Subrange 636. There's really not much to this one, or a lot of easily noticeable progression. Just repetitive and deep, sparse melodic licks with spurts of percussion, and everything covered in boatloads of reverb, of course. You kinda just gotta let this one wash over you and its atmosphere soak you up. Not you soak it up, it soaks you up. Listening to this feels like I'm slowly being lowered down an endless elevator shaft or something. It's pretty cool. And I still prefer this track's more subtle approach over their later near hour-long ambient epic All End, but whatever. As a whole, while Quadrange is still mostly supplementary material and not better than its main album, it certainly does have an identity in the Autechre catalog, getting by on being one of the most immersive and almost certainly the single most low-key release they've put out. At 2.5 hours, it is a commitment. But it's far from the biggest commitment of a listen they have to their name. And its relative simplicity makes it the kind of thing you probably know how you feel on first listen. If it feels like the kind of thing you'd be up to, give it a shot. I'll give the whole package a 7.3 out of 10. Alright, we're getting into the home stretch now. Time to move on to the companion EP to their Oversteps album from 2010. It's Move of 10. Yet another EP technically long enough to be an album, but it is what it is. While parts of this project do resemble parts of Oversteps, for the most part it seems to go against that album's more ambient melodic approach, and towards something much more beat-heavy. There's roughly an equal amount of reverb applied to the mixes of both albums, but otherwise, yeah, pretty different experience this one. I've even heard people say that this project has a 90s throwback feel to it, gave them vibes that brought them back to the Amber days. And this is not the case all the way through. A lot of it is kinda like all rhythmically shuffling, doesn't have a solid pulse, a little more characteristic of their later period stuff, but a few moments do in fact feel like that. I mean, the opener, Echogon S, does not particularly feel like a throwback. It kind of ends up somewhere between XI and Draft, with its sort of not really pulse that chaotically wobbles around, and melodies that plunk all over the freaking place. Wasting no time getting into the freaky migraine-inducing stuff. Or maybe that's just the Autechre burnout getting me, but eh. It does pick up after that, thankfully, and deliver some solid stuff from there. Y7 does have a solid 4/4 techno kick, barely present underneath a sea of buzzing and squirting synth textures. The kick's about as present as it would be on, like, a Gas album, but it's still definitely forming a pulse. That one's cool. And things really kick into gear with PCE Freeze 2.8i. There's a beat that absolutely slams. The kicks and snares are super huge and booming, while there's some creepy little synth licks peeking around the corners, from little buzzing bass lines to wailing organ pads to some acid squelching or what sounds like bursts of air hissing. That's definitely one of my favorites on here. Rue 1, meanwhile, gets a little more melodic with its dark synth progressions, mostly just playing the same notes and wavering up and down a half step or two. Still feeling like it's making a pretty solid build-up, and there's quite a few moments where the reverb just goes away and the mix feels like it's all gathering in a tiny little space and then just spreading out after that. Cool effect. I like the way this one just kind of keeps marching along steadily. Diffuser.b also kind of has a fun thumping beat to it, also featuring an intro of some little plunky 90s synth texture and some wailing pads that sound somewhere between saw blades and sirens. But once it gets going, all these elements are replaced by tons of reverb-covered Rhodes pianos and later a few little high-pitched licks peeking out here and there. Pretty neat. Iris Was a Pupil returns us more to Oversteps territory, a mostly ambient piece with layers of plunking synths. This one's actually a big grower since it feels more subtle and nocturnal and much less melodramatic than a lot of the stuff on the main album. Those plinking high-pitched leads kinda shoot over the top of the mix like shooting stars. Definitely a welcome change of pace here, and it transitions pretty seamlessly into No Border, which creates a very similar mood, but with some whooshing percussion textures to give it some more pulse. Maybe not the most memorable moment on here, but still another nice chill moment to have around. M62 though, there we have a real 90s throwback moment, like maybe somewhere between Amber and Chiastic Slide. Muted, intimate, warm pads and laid-back melodies plunking over a regular, steady techno kick drum. Very simple stuff, but given how so little of their stuff from this era is so simple, I will take it. One of the consistent highlights here. And there's one more kinda chill ambient piece in YLM0. Another track full of reverby Rhodes, butter smooth stuff, and even a few isolated waves of bass lines for that extra satisfying touch. But, you know, we started this EP on a chaotic and crazy note, so we're gonna end on one too. And our closer, Sep Puik MX. Fucking titles. It does feel a lot more earned in its craziness than the opener was. It feels a lot more urgent, starts out like everything's breaking down, and then moves into some fast-paced drum breaks and giant synth plucks that makes it feel like you're in a meteorite shower or something. Very nice way to go out. Overall, Move 10 is good. Stronger in its second half, but still pretty decent in its worst moments. Is it better than Oversteps? In some ways, sure. In other ways, not really. Oversteps has way better standouts and more of them, but Move 10 is much more economical and consistent. Unlike the main album, there's no tracks here which feel redundant or weigh down the experience. The opener tends to get me off on the wrong foot, but I think you just kinda gotta know what you're getting into, I think. There's a top-tier Autechre album between this and Oversteps if you just take their best moments. Move 10 is also the reverse of Oversteps in the way my opinion evolved with repeat listens. First return listen of Oversteps, I was like, that was really something, and as I went on, the subpar tracks and lack of unique ideas started to show themselves more and more. I remember liking Move 10 when I first heard it too, but first return listen, I was like, oh god, I am not in the mood for this bullshit. I was just so freaking tired and wanted nothing more than to get this freaking video done, but I also know this EP isn't actually that bad, so I listened to it like 3-4 more times to get back in its swing, but it was probably worth the extra effort in the end. I do like the whole spacey sci-fi vibe the whole thing has. It feels cleaner and more sterile in an alien sort of way, in contrast to the haunting, austere, dramatic, comparatively old-timey tones of Oversteps. But somehow still seems like it's cut from a similar cloth. It's a nice listen, definitely one of the better and more well-thought-out EPs in their catalog. even if I don't really listen to it that often. But yeah, I think I'll give it the same rating I gave Oversteps, 7.3 out of 10. So, we've made it to their last EP, their companion to Xi in 2013, called Envane. Not quite the last project I'll talk about from them overall. They had one more one-off single after this I'll briefly go over. But whatever. With this EP's announcement came several different websites that would quickly get corrupted and messed up, including their main Discogs page, I believe. I remember clicking on a link to that page and the whole site just like switching letters around, increasing the font size, changing the background. It was pretty nuts. Can't access that page anymore, but well. Just a shame this event happened in tandem with such a forgettable set of tracks. I mean, this is supposedly leftovers from Xi that didn't make the cut, probably because they weren't good enough. And yeah, they are absolutely nothing you haven't heard from them before in some way. Taklakora has some real crunch with its beats and almost feels like you're running through shards of glass. But also had me thinking they did this kind of idea so much better later on with LEC97HRS on NTS. M39 Diffane has some cool glassy tones as well, like you're in the middle of a giant glass pitcher or something. And there's other neat bell noises and whomping bass, but no coherent groove ever really seems to come out of it. And I still feel like I've heard these kinds of textures done better on several other tracks of theirs. Ozla for N sounds like you're rapidly and repeatedly scraping a skateboard's wheels across the same bit of concrete over and over, and almost but not quite comes together for a solid groove, like 6-7 minutes in. Out of 8. And Newbound, the percussion flying about seemingly at random is not helping, but it at least has some squirty Triumph and acid leads for some actual melody. Not exactly holding me on the edge of my seat here though, especially after Move a 10. It's kinda shocking how little I care about the material on this EP, given how great the album it accompanies is. I guess I like how the 4 tracks here kinda link into each other, but otherwise it was just flat boring more than anything. It almost made me revert to my old pre-2016 mindset on these guys that their music is inhuman and lacks melody or emotion. I know better than to say things like that now, but damn did I not feel anything out of this one. From anyone else it'd be quite impressive, but by their standards this is totally rote and plain, it just shows them on autopilot. I think IDM producer Isotope summed it up best in this release's Discogs comments. There is only one word to describe the textures of the tracks on this EP: oatmeal. 5.5 out of 10. So in an attempt to not end this video in a total anticlimactic disappointment, here's one more single they released, the last official release of theirs that was of an approachable length. Released in 2017, there was JNSN code GL16/SPL47, a one-off single created for Touched Music with proceeds going to Macmillan Cancer Support. As it turns out, this was some good stuff. JNSN code GL16 starts out with all these plunking and bouncing melodies, and I was like, oh great, here we go again. But the whole mix eventually gets enveloped by this warm and ethereal and emotional ambient pad, until at the very end, of course, when you have all these weird modulated clanking sounds. But yeah, I really enjoyed that. And SPL47 is this really fast-paced drum and bass thing, which is not as good, but at the very least, unlike the stuff on Envane, it feels like it's going somewhere. Often feels like it has all these bubble-blowing noises in the mix. It's pretty fun too. Neither of these tracks are among my favorites they've ever done, but this was as satisfying a place as I need to finish this video. Single's worth giving a shot, not rating it, and I'm now going to leave it at that. There are other minor releases and one-off tracks I skipped over, but that is all the Autechre I am willing to go through for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, because this took a lot of goddamn work to put together as per usual with these odds and ends videos. Top 10 video and worst to best ranking coming soonish. Basically already got them in order, so maybe even be sooner than you think, but we'll see. But of course these are all just my opinions. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.